Mhm. So this is recording. So today we would like to welcome Anna Devenish. She is an independent researcher. She has a doctorate in public policy from Oregon State University in the USA. Anna will talk today about public views of and responses to renewable energy development. So this is a very relevant topic for our research group, and we're looking forward to Anna's talk today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to talk about my research. I think every researcher is happy to talk about their studies, including me. And so today we'll talk about public views of and responses to renewable energy development. I will present empirical research that I have done during my master's and my PhD program at Oregon State University. And we'll be looking mostly at Western American states. So it's California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. By the way, this picture that's on the slide, I took during my fieldwork when I was interviewing proponents and opponents of wind energy development. It would be okay with me if you ask me some clarifying questions during the presentation, but I'm not sure how it's set up during these seminars. But again, if you want to clarify something, just go ahead and ask the question. So there are three themes that we'll be looking at today, examining societal views and responses to renewables. The first one is level of public familiarity with renewable energy technology. The second is public attitudes toward renewable energy technology. And the third one is local responses to renewables. And we'll start with the last two. So first of all, why do we talk about public attitudes and responses to renewable energy? There is a scientific consensus that the Earth is experiencing climate change, and countries pledge to reduce their CO2 emissions, and to do so, they propose to develop more renewable energy. And when we talk about renewables such as wind and solar energy, we need to understand we talk about electricity, because these sources are used to generate electricity. And you can see on this graph that there has been a major increase in renewable energy consumption in the United States. In 2019, US renewable energy consumption surpassed coal for the first time since the end of the 18th century. And back then, people in the US were using renewables to they were basically burning wood. They used biomass. And now, when we talk about, again, renewable energy, we talk about mostly wind and solar. So there are changes in, I'm sorry, there's a, I'm looking at the chat okay, there are questions in the end. Okay. So there are major changes in the way that electricity is generated in the United States. So you can see on this graph that there is historical data prior to 2020, and there's a projection. And in 2020, 21% of electricity was generated using renewables in the United States. And again, it includes hydropower, biomass, renewable wind, solar, and geothermal. And by 2050, this number is expected to double. So clearly, there will be more renewable energy, but we need to think about where do we put these projects, such as solar and wind. They need to go somewhere. And And there are two types of renewable energy projects. The first is utility scale or large scale. So you can have hundreds or thousands of wind turbines or solar panels together in one place, and then the project developer sells this output of electricity to the wholesale market. That's one way to procure renewable energy. Another way is to have small scale projects. So you, as a citizen, can put a solar panel on your rooftop and just use it for your consumption. So again, the more renewable energy projects we have, the more space we need for them to be developed. And I'm going to talk about this phenomenon where local communities sometimes mobilize against renewable energy projects. And I'm going to present you this article that was published in Energy Research and Social Science, and the title is Opposition Overblown: Community Response to Wind Energy Siting in the Western United States. So when I was at Oregon State University, when I first got there, that was 2014. And my advisor told me that they have a project that looks at community mobilization toward wind energy. And I was really surprised because I really didn't think that people can oppose such a good thing as renewable energy. But indeed, they have a grant from the federal government to study because there was quite a lot of opposition. And about 10 or 15 graduate students worked on this project. So I think the project was like for 4 years or so. So scholars identified a gap in public attitudes. So on the one hand, they saw that there were positive attitudes toward wind energy in general. So people in general say, yes, of course, I support renewable energy. Yes, let's develop it. But scholars and citizens also saw that there was local resistance against some concrete proposals. So when it first happened, scholars and people were put in a label on this type of opposition as not in my backyard. So people thought that, well, yes, let's develop renewable energy, but let's not put it in my backyard. Let's put it somewhere else. But so if everyone is saying this, so where are we going to put projects? However, over time, it was clear that this label, this NIMBY label, had really really limited explanatory power. And scholars started to understand and examine in a more nuanced way public attitudes toward wind energy. And so it's a really well-established scholarship, and I'm just putting here one model that was produced by Bidwell to look at public attitudes and the factors that influence attitudes toward wind energy. So one of the most important factors is the underlying values, and then values that influence other factors. And other factors include environmental beliefs. But with environmental beliefs, it's interesting here because there is a global environmental benefit to wind energy, and people who worry about climate change might support renewable energy and wind energy in particular, but also people are worried about some local wildlife threats that wind energy brings. So for instance, people were worried about birds and bats that were dying because of the wind turbines. They just crash into them. So there was this kind of a clash in environmentalists, and some people call it green versus green, where again, global and local environmental beliefs really oppose each other. There's also a contextual factor that influences attitudes toward wind energy, and that could be place attachment. So some people can really have emotional attachment to the place, to a specific place where the project was supposed to be developed. So people might describe this place such as, it's a reflection of me, no other place can compare to this place, it's a favorite place to be, or I feel happiest when I'm there. So that kind of emotional attachment can characterize a place. There is also distributive justice or perceived wind farm effects. So these effects could be positive. They could be positive locally or creating jobs. So if there's a project to be developed, you need to hire people. And so that brings jobs to the community. There is also a benefit of tax revenue. So the project is going to generate tax revenue that goes back to the community. And there's also a global benefit of fighting climate change. But there are also some negative things that wind energy projects can bring to the community. And they're often local. So those would be visual and noise pollution. So these wind turbines are really huge and they can just change the landscape dramatically. There is also some noise from the rotating of the turbine. There can be some public health or safety issues. There can be, as I said, some local wildlife threats. There also can be some property values going down, and also just general disturbance during the construction period. Roads, for example, might be damaged by the construction. And the last factor is perceived fairness or procedural justice. So it's the way people see the decision-making process, whether they see it transparent, just, and whether they have trust in the regulators and the industry. And so all these factors, according to scholars, can shape people's attitudes toward wind energy. There is also a literature that is considering mobilization. So that would be not just attitudes, but actions of the community, mobilization efforts. And a conceptual model of mobilization against locally unwanted land use, LULU, the acronym, was used to inform our study. So those local unwanted land use facilities could be like a landfill, a wind energy project, a solar energy project, and some other large facilities. And there are 5 factors that, according to the scholars, so these factors contribute to the community mobilization. So the first one is the exogenous shock. So the fact that a project, the announcement that a project is going to be built is an exogenous shock, and so the community start mobilizing. And then the second factor is the mobilizing structures or political opportunities. So those would be some venues where people can really participate in the decision-making process and can really participate. And so there are also perceived risks. So if the perceived risks are really high, the community is more likely to mobilize. For instance, if it's a landfill or some hazardous material facility, So people are going to mobilize. There is also the framing of threat. That would be what opponents use to really get more supporters. And so they would frame issues in a way to really present issues so that they have more supporters. And the last one is community resources. So you really need some organizational resources from the community, and also if the community is affluent, has higher income, is more educated, it has more resources to engage in mobilization activities. So we had a research problem. So we had these two disparate literatures. One is on wind energy attitudes, another is literature on social movements. And first of all, we wanted to kind of bridge these two literatures because they were talking a lot of times about the same thing, but really not talking to each other. And there were also a challenge with literature on social movements that a lot of times it was a case study of a really contentious case. So scholars would choose on the dependent variable. So they would choose a contentious case and then do a study. But then that would really cause some questions about the generalizability of the results. So would the same factors work if the researchers picked not a contentious case? And one challenge with the wind energy attitudes scholarship was that they focused on attitudinal outcomes, but not the response of the community. And so therefore, we had two research objectives. So first of all, we wanted to determine the level of opposition to proposed wind energy projects, to basically to all projects, not just to contentious ones. And then the second research objective was to examine the factors and processes that shape opposition across a wide range of proposals in the Western US. So we used fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis. It's a set theoretic method, and it identifies sufficient and necessary conditions, basically some causal combinations that lead to a certain outcome. So in our case, it would be mobilization of a community. And there were several advantages to use this method. So one is it allowed analysis of middle and sample. So in our case, in our study, we had 53 cases. So this is a compromise between more traditional methodological strategies of depth, where you use 1, 2, 3 maybe cases when you do qualitative case studies, and breadth, where you use a large N statistical analysis. It also allows to integrate nuanced case-specific qualitative data and quantitative data together. So our data collection, we had 4 states, California, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And we tried to identify all the wind energy projects that were proposed in those counties over 5 years, from 2008 to 2013. And so we looked at projects that also failed, and we included them in our sample. And so we had 53 proposed projects in 25 counties, and these counties are highlighted in red on the map. Our data sources included regional and local newspapers. So we looked at news articles, editorials, letters to the editor, and event announcements. And so that led us to develop some kind of basic understanding of the case, and also to identify the main stakeholders that were really important in those cases. And then we had county-level population characteristics data, county-level governance data, and we also conducted in-person and telephone interviews, and we conducted 84 interviews in total. So about findings, how much opposition did we actually find? And evidence of at least one type of opposition was found in 43 out of 53 proposals, 81%. So those opposition activities could include write-in letters to the newspaper, public testimony, appeals, lawsuits, petitions, opposition meetings, rallies or protests, attempts to recall public officials, and then there was no sabotage and there was no arrest in our sample. But we just included those because they're known types of mobilization activity to these locally unwanted land use facilities. And only 90 out of 53 proposals, one third, a little more than 1/3, experienced 3 or more types of opposition. So we concluded that this is not a lot of opposition. And also these opposition activities were bounded by institutional structures. For instance, again, editorial letters, some testimonies, lawsuits, and so on. And those activities did not require high level of collective action. Only in 8% of the proposals we found evidence of a protest or a rally. So that was to answer our first research question. And then to answer the second research question, what factors shape opposition? Our method produced 5 so-called recipes that led to community mobilization. And you can see that a combination of different factors. So for instance, the first one would be wildlife threat, aesthetics threat that opponents used, and then political opportunity led to mobilization. The second one, wildlife threat, aesthetics threat, and proximity to a protected area led to a mobilization. And if you look through these 5 recipes, you will see that wildlife threat framing was used, was basically important in 4 out of 5 recipes. So opponents used it a lot. And then you can see also that political opportunity is present in 3 out of 5 cases. So also aesthetics threat is present in 3 cases, and economic threat is also present in 3 recipes. So the conclusion here is that, first of all, we found no evidence of strong community contention in response to wind proposals. And this is contrary to some scholarship that is, again, has considered really contentious cases and created this narrative of these really contentious nature of wind energy. And then the second conclusion is that most opposition activities took the shape of institutionally based individual or collective action. And also there is a notable role of political opportunity where additional access points to the public to enter the decision-making process were important for the opponents to really organize themselves. So that was about public attitudes and local responses to renewables. But now we will move to the level of familiarity with renewable energy technology. And to look into that, I will present briefly a study that I also conducted at Oregon State University where we looked at public familiarity with geothermal energy in the American West. And you can see that Western states and California and Nevada specifically have a lot of potential, but also developed projects of geothermal energy. And in the literature, there were quite a few studies considering attitudes toward a renewable energy technology, but there were fewer studies that considered what factors are associated with public familiarity with geothermal energy. So making public familiarity a dependent variable was really not as prominent in the scholarship. And so we wanted to fill this gap by doing this paper. So we conducted a survey and we mailed surveys with an additional online link to randomly chosen households in 3 states, California, Oregon, and Washington. There were 1,400 surveys mailed in each state. And these samples of randomly chosen households we obtained through a commercial firm. And you can see that the response rate is really high in all states. So we used a binary dependent variable. So 1 was when people were familiar or very familiar with geothermal energy, and then 0 when people were not familiar or somewhat familiar. And we used a logistic regression for analysis. And so in the literature, we found that values and beliefs lead to the search of a particular information. And those who committed strongly to some policy views or some policy outcomes, they tend to have a higher level of knowledge seeking. So those people would seek more information if they have a stake in a certain policy outcome. And the theory of motivated cognition also tells that information processing is driven by heuristics, so that people emphasize information that correlates with their values or with values of their peers. And we hypothesized that people with higher level of environmental concern, with higher level of concern over climate change, and people with higher concern over energy scarcity would be more familiar with geothermal energy because they would probably seek that information. We also controlled for sociodemographic factors such as education, income, age, and gender. So these are descriptive statistics, and I think I'm just gonna let you look at the slides. I'm not gonna walk you through that because the numbers are kind of self-explanatory. So I'm just gonna give you a minute or so to look at the slides. So in terms of results, the first result is that the level of familiarity with geothermal energy. So the question was, how familiar are you with specific renewable energy technology? And we could see that 1/3 of the respondents were familiar or very familiar. So roughly 30% in each state. And roughly 70% were not familiar or had some information, somewhat familiar. So this tells us that the level of familiarity is low. There are also some correlates that we found. So first of all, we didn't find any impact of environmental concern measured through the new ecological paradigm, contrary to our hypothesis. And so we were wondering why it might be the case. And in the literature, we found that people who support wind and solar energy don't have the same attitudes toward hydro and geothermal energy. And that is because hydropower and geothermal have bigger physical impact on the land. And so that could be similar with in terms of familiarity. So people just prefer to focus on wind and solar. That could be one explanation why it's the case. We found that gender played a role. So female women tend to be less familiar than men. And then education had a positive association in California and Washington. So those would be the main results. And then the implications here would be that, first of all, low level of familiarity with a technology could be challenging for engaging citizens in a conversation. And to produce really good decision making, you need to have people who know what is going on. And if you don't have that, so that could be really problematic for the decision making. And also, if people don't have facts, it could become a fertile ground for controversy in some fact-denying situations. And we have some recommendations for future research. First one is maybe future research can examine rural and urban differences. We didn't look into that. And also could consider as a dependent variable the level of knowledge of different types of things. So not just the general familiarity, are you familiar or not, but what type of information do you have? Do you know more about risks, or do you know more about benefits of the technology? Do you know about the economic part of it, or do you know more about the technological part of it, or the environmental part of it? So what kind of information do you have? And also it could be interesting and useful to check or to investigate the same hypotheses in different contexts, cultural, country, governance regime, to see if the results hold. So this is all I have, and I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was a really interesting talk. And I think, you know, it's interesting that in other areas, yeah, as public policy or, you know, anything that is related to energy that is not environmental psychology, you do operate very similar concepts or just the same concepts, yeah, that have been developed in environmental psychology. So there is a lot of possibility of dialogue between these different areas, and probably a clear sign that, you know, we should conduct more interdisciplinary research in this area. So that is really, really interesting, and the results that you're presenting are very relevant, something that we also need to think about as you know, more probably in the area of environmental psychology. We have time for questions now, and if anyone would like to be first to ask, you are very welcome to. Yeah, please don't be shy. Any kind of questions are absolutely fine.
I have a question. If no one else want to go before me.
Yes, please. Micha.
Um, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, for this presentation. It was really interesting. The topic is really interesting and really new, and I really think this has not been researched very well. So thank you for the presentation. And like I have, I guess, one of the most important question. When you said about the not on my backyard like phenomenon, when you talk about renewable energy, like people are in general in favor of this, but when it comes to really placing this like renewable energy facilities near some places where people live, people don't really want them to be there. And I just had this like thought, do these attitudes translate to other energy sources like oil or coal? Because, for example, when you have reserves near placements where people live, or when you have coal reserves, people like, maybe it is only like, it has to be studied maybe cross culturally, maybe it's only like in Kazakhstan, for example, where I'm from, but people don't really mind coal mines near their like where they live, or oil reserves or whatever. So but these places really have bad health consequences. So have you like studied this? Have you compared maybe like, why do people think this is very bad for them? Because as far as I know, renewable energy sources are not really bad for people's health or well-being or anything. Mm, yeah, and maybe also maybe you have some like considerations on cross-cultural studies on this, but I think there is not very much in other countries.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. And as I mentioned, when I got to Oregon State University and they told me that they have a project looking at these mobilization activities, I was just shocked that so many people oppose renewable energy. I thought it was just not possible. I never thought about it, but people do. And I guess maybe I was not familiar with it because we don't have a lot of renewable energy in Russia, for instance. So if we had more projects, there would be more potentially opposition. But in countries like Europe and the United States and China, there are just a lot of projects. There's, so there's just more going on, right? So that first, right? The more projects you have proposed, the more likely opposition you're going to have. In terms of oil reserves and pipelines, and also like liquefied natural gas terminals, that was really a big topic in Oregon. So Oregon is on the Pacific Ocean. So the US wants to transport natural gas that is liquefied to other places. And so they wanted to build these liquefied natural gas terminals. And people were really, really, really against it. So if you compared, for example, that opposition to wind energy opposition, of course, it would be much higher. So that was probably our finding, that there is not a lot of opposition to wind energy, although there still was some. But compared to these liquefied natural gas terminals or pipelines, there was a huge protest of this pipeline that goes from Canada to the United States, and it was really, really contentious. So there's written a lot about it. People are really active, and also fracking. I don't know if you know about fracking.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, this hydraulic
Oil.
fracture. Yeah, so a lot of people also oppose that in places like the East Coast, like in Pennsylvania, also in Colorado. So where they found these fossil fuels, right? Uh, and there's a lot of studies. I didn't do personally, but people in my school did look into that. And for instance, some people, also look at it as an economic benefit, but many more people look at it as a bad externality. But in terms of, again, coming back to opposition to renewables, so I interviewed people who opposed it, right? And so imagine people who were from Portland, Oregon. They retired. They bought this beautiful home. They moved there. They just wanted this pristine, really quiet place where they just wanted to retire. And then this industrial project comes in and just really cancels all their dreams. And so, of course, they don't like that because it just, it brings, again, what I mentioned, just visual pollution. You just have to look not at the mountain or a lake, but you have to look at these industrial turbines. There's also noise and just some inconveniences to people. But that's just like kind of one example. Another example where people, it was a neighboring county or like a municipality where people were farming. They didn't come from a city to retire there. They were farming their whole life, and they were getting some lease payments from the developers to put the turbines, so they could continue farming and get the money from the developers. And those people loved the projects. So it really depends on the particular case, what place it is, what kind of people live there, and whether they have the capacity to really mobilize themselves. I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Yes, thank you. I was just not sure whether you studied something about opposition to other energy resources, but it's really interesting to see that actually, like, any infrastructure and development around energy, like, invites this kind of opposition. And but it is like really great that people like don't oppose a renewable energy as much as other sources. So
because they're not, as you mentioned, they're not as harmful. They don't have as much bad negative consequences. Negative consequences. I'm thinking of an article that I'm going to send you. It's about actually Kazakhstan, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm just going to send it to you.
wow, thank you.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So maybe, to continue Fatiha's question and something that I was thinking about. So your conclusion in the study, what you found is that there was no opposition. So would you say it's in this particular case that there was no opposition? And also right now you mentioned that it probably depends on the particular situation, on the type of people, so a combination of conditions. If you were to formulate a kind of, I don't know if that were possible at all, a kind of summary of evidence, what kind of conclusion would it be? Is it still, it depends? Is it there is no opposition, or there is a position like the NIMBY people keep saying?
Well, again, so if if you just wanted to read something about wind energy, you would find a lot of cases in the media, in the scholarly literature. Oh, these like people opposed it, and you would think, oh yeah, there's a lot of opposition, because what you would see these contentious cases. But you know, that's exactly what we tried to eliminate in our research. So we selected 53 projects, right? 53 projects where there was opposition and there was no opposition. And so we tried to look at these cases in a systematic way, right? So we wouldn't choose on the contentious case to study what factors influence it, but we would study both opposition and no opposition. So we found that in a lot of cases, the opposition really was just people writing letters to the newspaper. That was it. Or people were writing letters and presenting their testimony at the hearing of the project, and that was it. Or people, you know, and only in 8% of the cases, people were like marching, protesting with like some, you know, posters or whatnot. Again, that tells us that there is just not a lot of activity. So it's this contention is not the norm for wind energy. That's what we found by looking at these cases, kind of not just choosing one or two, but looking at all proposed projects in 4 states. So we didn't discriminate against any project.
Yeah. Well, that I think that has been shown also many times in Europe. That has been shown, I think, several times that the opposition was not, you know, as strong as it was believed. Probably, you know, we could also think that because it's a new energy source and there is more attention to it, more coverage, and obviously that creates overrepresentation of, you know, how much there is opposition to renewable, you know, energy. So yeah, and if we look into opposition to fracking, it tends to be much stronger, as well. That's another new source. And is there any evidence on Russia regarding opposition to renewable energy? Do we know anything?
I don't think so. Well, we don't have a lot of renewable energy, right? So I'm aware of any study that considered opposition to it, really. We have projects in Ulyanovsk. We have some projects in the southern part of Russia, solar, but really I'm not aware of any. I know that customers and, you know, advocates who advocate for customers, this association is against it because it is likely to increase the price of electricity. So it's not about the project siting, right? Putting it in a specific place, but it's about just no renewable energy at all, because it's not for our country, because we really need some other things to deal with first. You know, it's not our priority, so we don't want our electricity to go up. That's what I saw kind of, you know, against. But you also saw that our president recently said that we're gonna, you know, participate in CO2 emission reduction and everything. So I don't know. It looks like there's going to be some actions toward it. And I talked about the large scale projects, mostly, right? These like big projects, but I didn't talk about small scale, such as solar panel on your rooftops. And in Russia, it's called microgeneration. And there was an order recently that talked about the regulatory mechanisms of how to, so basically people put that solar panel on their roofs. And then they also need to maybe, you know, sell some access of electricity to the electrical grid, or maybe when they don't have enough electricity that they generate, they need to get it from the grid. And so all these things, so that order was really talking about how it's going to all play out. So there's also interest here, and we have a company called Geothermal that produces and sells those. And so here it would be interesting to see why people adopt those technologies. So for instance, what motivates them? Is it environmental values? Is it maybe they want to save money, on electricity, or those things? So I think that could be interesting to look in the Russian context, adoption of this small kind of adoption of these technologies that help mitigate climate change, even electric vehicles, things like that.
Yes, indeed. Well, just briefly, because I'm sure when wind energy, well, solar energy is a slightly different issue, probably. Well, however, yeah, whenever West has started to use this widely, renewable energy, it obviously had a cost. So it had a cost for everyone compared to traditional sources of energy. And I'm wondering why. Well, I probably know the answer, but somehow, are there any arguments? We know why there is probably an opposition in Russia about this. It can be related to economic, factors. However, I wonder if there are ways to overcome it, what we can explain to, how we can negotiate engaging into renewable initiatives anyway, because at the end of the day, they end up saving a lot of money also, yeah? So, because precisely it's renewable. So, is there any way, if you have, this evidence available, just do you know if there is a way to sell it in a different way?
Yeah, I think, well, so I'm part of this, there is a group at Skolkovo Institute or whatever it is, and they have summer schools, summer energy schools. And so their last year school was all about transition. It's called energy transition, right, to low carbon energy. There are a lot of players in Russia that they're engaged. And if you look at that group, you think that everything happens is about renewables or kind of transition to low carbon. So there is a lot of interest for sure from actors. You might know that Europe is now imposing not taxes, but fees on our goods that are produced with a lot of CO2 emissions. So basically, I think why there's a lot of attention right now, because even from the president, is because it's either our country and our companies find a way to reduce CO2 emissions and then sell whatever to Europe and other countries, or we just be imposed, the countries will impose these fees on us. And so we'll just lose a lot of money. And so there is also, I think there are a lot of people who have pro-environmental values and beliefs, and they want to participate. And it's like with any other thing that, is new, and like the plastic or just kind of sustainable lifestyles. The problem here is that it needs resources. It's like easier to just abandon plastic than to install a solar panel on your rooftop or to buy an electric car. So it's more resource intensive here. But if our government can support, individuals, like for instance, in other countries, they have tax credits. So if you buy this resource, then you can pay less taxes. Some kind of, campaigns. I think people are really open and really want some environmental action. So yeah, I mean, it will depend on a particular technology, but I think there's a lot of room really to kind of start doing something here.
Yeah, definitely. There is also discussion, just To add to this, there is a discussion on some particular ways to generate renewable energy in Russia. For example, they're discussing photosynthesis as you know, it's Kurchatov University that is institute that is working on it. They talked about hydrogen power. However, recently I also came across evidence that hydrogen power can also have detrimental effects, side effects on the environment. So I think probably Russia, you know, because one of the reasons, I guess, there is not so much engagement into the renewables as they're known in the West. So in particular, solar and wind, it's probably because, you know, of technologies. So unless they're created here locally, there will be probably much resistance to it. But yeah, we shall see, you know, how the future basically, you know, what the future prepares to us in this area. But I just cannot, disagree with the idea that we will need to, as the rest of the world does, transition to different sources of energy. Yeah,
it's probably going to be specific to our reality, and so maybe that's again the task of the research community to understand what it is.
Yeah, that's definitely a much needed topic to research, I think. Probably you know, anyone else who would like to ask questions? It's a really interesting discussion, so any of your questions have a lot of interest to us.
Yeah, even maybe clarifying or just
Yeah.
If you have any questions.
All right, thank you. My name is Kingsley. I would like to, first of all, I want to thank you for your edifying presentation. It was quite interesting. So I just want to ask your opinion regarding the apparent political polarization in the United States particularly. How would you constitute the effects of political polarization regarding the opposition to renewable energies, particularly wind energy? And how can you compare that with perhaps a different country that doesn't have as much polarization, and how relevant is political opportunities and political polarization in the opposition, in your opinion?
Thank you so much for your question. So the first one, polarization, right? It's interesting that a lot of Republicans, right, with more conservative values. So you would think that conservative traditional values would prohibit renewables, right? So we think that liberal values and openness to change would help renewable energy. But a lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives support renewable energy, especially now that it's cheap. So a lot of, if you talk about local level, you know, the communities, right, where the projects go. So we had a lot of a lot of conservative communities. And they really welcome the projects because it brings some again, tax revenue, sometimes payments directly to the farmers. If you lease your land to the developer, it just gives you money, and people love it, both Republicans and Democrats. If you talk about it on the more kind of a broad level, you know, just not about specific projects, but in general, people like tax credits. They just install the technology and get money back. You know, they love it. And then they, for instance, they install a solar panel on their roof and then get tax credit for it, and they just don't pay their electricity bill, and they're really happy about it. So again, in general, yes, Democrats, I think, pushed it in the beginning to kind of get things going and to really produce this economy of scale where the more the more projects you have, the cheaper it is. So basically, in the beginning, Democrats pushed this agenda because of environmental issues. But now when it really economically, like the reason coal is going away, not because of environmental values, but because it's just not economically competitive compared to wind and solar. So prices really have dropped drastically, with China developing a lot of solar panels. And it's not an issue. So I did an internship in Utah, and Utah is probably the most conservative state in the United States. And so they said, we waited until the prices got cheap, and now we engage it with it. We're really happy to do it. So I guess right now the polarization is not much of a factor. But in terms of political opportunity, you mentioned in the end, so if we talk about the local level, the project level, right? So political opportunity here is basically if the institutions allow you to participate in the decision-making process. So, so it's basically how the permitting process is set up. So in some cases, they create what's called an overlay zone. So basically, they say it's all cleared for projects, for renewable energy projects, and people cannot just provide their input. And so that would be less political opportunity. But in other cases, they have a lot of kind of access points where there is some public debate and some input for public opinion to provide it. And so in those cases, people are just more likely to participate and really provide their input, and then it could lead to some, I don't know, some mobilization. But if they cannot participate, they're just not going to be able to, and that's it. End of story. So yeah. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's actually quite interesting because this actually points to somewhat of a disconnect between the public rhetoric on this matter regarding, for example, in the news. If I would reference, for example, the recent crisis in Texas, where you had the power problem. If you look at the mainstream media at the time, it pointed to the fact that mostly the conservative media was trying to blame the renewable energy regarding this problem. The wind turbines probably froze and all of that. So it appears to be a heavily politicized matter. So you would think from viewing it from the mainstream media, that political polarization might have a huge effect. But it's quite interesting that your research doesn't show particularly any serious effects there.
I just have something to add here about Texas. It's interesting how things are framed or how they're presented in terms of narratives. So people blamed wind turbines that froze, but what happened really was that the gas-fired power plant couldn't function in the temperatures because it was just not set up for these temperatures. And so what happened was that fossil fuel power plants didn't work, and renewables also didn't work, but it wasn't the main problem that renewables didn't work. Basically, nothing worked. So, but the way it was framed was, yes, let's blame the renewables.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I thought there's kind of like a political angle there. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, people always exploit it if there's a way to do so.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I would just probably like to add to that political polarization and support of pro-environmental action indeed is a very nuanced topic, and I totally, I just looked for, it rang my bell, and I just looked for a study. It's a study from 2014 by Campbell and Kay, basically saying that conservatives are less likely to indicate climate change is a problem when solutions involve governmental regulation. Well, remember, it's an article from 2014. And then also, if that involves government regulation, it probably doesn't cost them anything. And there were more, than when market-based solutions were proposed. Well, first of all, it's it's been 7 years, yes, since this was the case, and probably the study was conducted earlier. First of all, the acceptability, I guess, of it's just with any kind of policy, the acceptability grows over time, usually. And probably we did face indeed a lot of, discontent with renewable infrastructures, renewable energy infrastructures when this just began. And that also, that's why that created such an interest, from the point of view of, I guess, studying opposition, studying the NIMBY phenomenon, and so on and so forth. But with time, that decreases probably, and also with time, as Anna said just now, the main interest of right wing, because that's where the basically most of financial interest lies, is the same financial interest. So of course, these people have to be practical, and when that starts to bring profit, and future is obviously lies in this kind of area. So there should be, there should be less opposition. Regarding, other areas of pro-environmental action, that's questionable. So as soon as this becomes more rentable economically, there will be more interest on their behalf. But as we often discuss, I think, as a group and at various seminars and so on, we are in a kind of situation right now as a society, as a civilization, where all sorts of opinions, all sorts of positions really need to be taken into account, and we should tap into the interest of each and every one to understand it better and to know where we can find the window of opportunity within this position, so that this environmental agenda becomes relevant to just everyone, not necessarily as an environmentalist agenda, but as a way to just survive as a civilization, because we are at the point obviously of very serious global environmental change problems, climate change problems. So as we need to find this solution, it needs a whole society approach. So of course, from that point of view, it's not too bad that Republicans support renewable energy.
Absolutely, yeah. But it's also interesting when you have a lot of renewables, it can pose some challenges for the grid, because renewables are intermittent, right? So electricity works that to generate it and consume it at the same time, right?
Yeah.
If you don't do it at the same time, then your system is going to break. And when you had coal, when you had natural gas, nuclear, that's called baseload resources that were operating 24 hours, 7 days a week, then you didn't have a problem. So you needed more resource, you just put more coal, and then you needed less, okay. But then imagine the situation where you have a lot of demand from people, but your sun is not shining, or the wind is not blowing. And with the sun, you basically know when it's going to shine or not, more or less. But with wind, it's harder to predict, because you can have more or less power, and so. But your whole system depends on these resources, and if you have 10% of those resources, you're fine. But what if you have 50% of such resource? That becomes really, really interesting, and that is going to be like way, later. But there is a way. So for my dissertation, actually, I studied what's called demand response. So when people really modify their electricity consumption based on the signal from the utility. So the utility tells them to maybe consume less energy during the next 2 hours, and they just consume less. And we have that in Russia a little bit, but so yeah, just a side note here.
Yeah, well, that's the intermittency is one of the problems, and one of the solutions to this intermittency from, I've heard about, worked on a grant proposal in related areas a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, the grant was not awarded. It's a very hard to get scheme. However, it's Belmont consortium. Yeah, so we were not awarded as a big international team the money, but however, from this proposal, I do remember that one of the solutions is to build mega storage units, and that requires huge amounts of metals, basically the same sort of materials that are used in accumulators in your mobile phones and so on and so forth. But to store the renewable energy, and also that the supply is regular, it needs to be stored, because at times there is overproduction, and that needs to be to go somewhere. And one of the extremely non-sustainable solution that was proposed to, and it's actually going ahead, I think, in the world, different countries are exploring this, is to do deep sea mining. So develop deep sea mining that basically involves very unsustainable practices of breaking seafloor to extract metal, because there is no longer enough metal on the surface of the planet. So we need to go into the ocean to dig for it. And that is a very serious ecological threat, not only to coastal communities, but potentially to a wider society. So yeah, how that is going to be solved, we don't know yet, but so far it seems that countries are going ahead with their plans, even if there is a lot of opposition from ecologists and other and scientific community mainly, and environmental activists like Greenpeace and maybe others. So yeah, but that needs to be taken into account. Maybe evolutions in technology will be such that I think there are some types of solar panels nowadays that don't need the sun to shine. It's just enough to get the light. Yeah, and this is just a very minor thing, and I'm sure the technology is already developing in the sense to be able to produce these kind of devices, technologies, and so on. Anyhow, maybe just one more quick question from me, and then maybe anyone else would like to actually chip in with a question, and I'll hold mine towards the end if there is time. Veronica, Natasha, Elena, anyone else who would like to ask Anna a question, please?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if you could share the presentation with us afterwards. It's really
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll look for that article I mentioned about Kazakhstan and the presentation. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, if you could send it to Fatiha, and then she'll share it with everyone.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, maybe I'll maybe ask a quick question on. I saw in the data that there was an association between belief in climate change, I think, or seriousness of climate change threat, and familiarity with geothermal energy in Oregon. That was the only place, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, it was not significant there. Yeah.
Oh, it was not. It was non-significant.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought I saw 3 asterisks in there, but maybe I just
gonna
yeah. But if you are saying,
No, I might be mistaken. Yeah.
Just looked like the other 2 states, California and New York, was it? Were not, and
Washington and California.
Yeah, well, if I look, I'm looking at the climate line. So we have 0.83 for 0.08 for California, and then 0.657 for Oregon. Is that correct? So we have three asterisks here. That's not for significance, that's for something else.
So you're looking for climate, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, it's significant in Oregon, and so climate was so believe that the Earth is getting warmer. So those people who yeah.
So why was it in Oregon and not in the other two states? Do you have like an idea?
I mean, I'm not really sure like how to explain this variation among these three states, because all the three states have really high pro-environmental values.
Right.
So.
And regarding the degree of their familiarity with geothermal energy, were they sort of equal as well? Yeah.
Yeah. So they were.
Yeah. So that's pretty much the same. Okay.
Yeah.
And belief in climate change.
Belief in climate change. Okay. So.
Yeah, the same.
Yeah. I'm not really sure how to explain this finding, because again, you would probably, so in California, they had a lot of projects. There was some in Oregon and no projects in Washington. So yeah, I'm not sure, maybe that kind of, the kind of move that's kind of significance to this other independent variable, because maybe they're just like more knowledge about the projects, because there's just a lot of projects in California, and so that this other variable lost its significance. I'm not sure how to explain that, but yeah, it's an interesting question.
Any other questions for Anna, please?
I just wanted to add just one thing about, I think someone asked me before about Russia, right? And what could be interesting to study is the diffusion of innovation, and so how the technology is diffused, right? And so here we will probably look at these kind of pioneers, right? The group of pioneers, and so what characteristics this group has, right? So what we could say about those people. Yeah, that was just kind of the last information that would be relevant to the Russian context.
Yeah. Last chance to ask a question. Anyone? Okay. Yeah, so I don't think we seem to have any more questions, but Anna, thank you so much again for your presentation. It was really interesting, and it's, we are discussing topics that indeed I think in Russia, at least, they're not really covered a lot. So there is much food for thought, and definitely we need research in this kind of area in our country, obviously adapted to our reality, and looking into how we can maybe solve the transition to renewables and basically accompany it, and so we can think about this in future, I'm sure, how to do this and what we need to do here. We will probably end the recording here. So thank you so much again.